November 12th, 1944. The morning dawned cold and clear over Tromsø Fjord in northern Norway. At exactly 9:35 a.m., squadron leader James "Willie" Tate eased the throttles forward on his Avro Lancaster, call sign Easy King, feeling the aircraft strain beneath its enormous burden. Slung in a specially modified bomb bay was a single weapon heavier than 2 African elephants. A 12,000-pound Tallboy bomb, 5 tons of meticulously engineered destructive power encased in hardened steel. The target lay 7 miles ahead across the frigid Norwegian waters, a grey leviathan that had haunted the British admiral's nightmares for 3 years. The German battleship Tirpitz, sister ship to the Bismarck, sat anchored in Hoka Sound, her massive 15-in guns, silent, but her mere existence tying down dozens of Allied capital ships that could not risk moving into the Atlantic while she remained operational. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Tate's approach that morning would be described in official reports as unorthodox, by his fellow pilots as reckless, and by German survivors as impossible. He would release his Tallboy from an altitude and angle that violated every bombing doctrine in the Royal Air Force manual. The bomb would fall for nearly 40 seconds, reaching speeds exceeding 700 man-hours before striking the Tirpitz armored deck. What happened in those 40 seconds and why Tate chose to drop the way he did reveals a story not of technological inevitability, but of calculated desperation, where established doctrine collided with operational reality, and one pilot's judgment determined whether Britain's most expensive bombing campaign would end in triumph or futility. The question that hung in the freezing air above Tromsø that morning was not whether the Tallboy could sink the Tirpitz. The mathematics suggested it could, but whether any pilot possessed the skill and audacity to deliver it under the specific conditions that November Day demanded. Tate believed he did. His bombardier, Flying Officer Danny Daniels, was less certain. The German anti-aircraft crews below were simply waiting, their 88mm guns loaded and tracking for the Lancasters to enter their kill zone. To understand why 29 Lancaster bombers carrying the most sophisticated precision weapons ever designed were converging on a single ship in a remote Norwegian fjord, one must first grasp the peculiar strategic mathematics of capital ships in the Second World War. The Tirpitz completed in February 1941 at the Wilhelmshaven. Navyr displaced 42,000 tons fully loaded and mounted 8 15-in guns capable of throwing a 1-ton shell 22 cm with reasonable accuracy. These specifications made her one of the most powerful surface combatants afloat, but her actual combat record told a different story. In 3 years of operational existence, the Tirpitz had fired her main batteries in anger exactly once during a brief shore bombardment of Allied positions on Spitsbergen in September 1943. She had never engaged an enemy warship. She had sunk no merchant vessel. By conventional measures of naval effectiveness, sorties completed and tonnage destroyed. The Tirpitz was the least successful capital ship in the German Navy. Yet the British Admiral T had expended more resources attempting to destroy the Tits than any other single target in the European theater. Submarines had penetrated Caulfield in September 1943, damaging her badly enough to require 6 months of repairs. Fleet air arm aircraft from HMS Victorious, Furious, Emperor, Fencer, Pursuer, and Searcher had launched repeated strikes. Operation Tungsten in April 19th, 44 being the most successful, inflicting casualties and damage, but failing to sink her. The Royal Navy had committed aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, and submarines to operations against this one vessel, accepting losses and operational risks that seemed disproportionate to the actual threat she posed. The explanation lay in a concept naval strategists called the fleet in being. The Tirpitz did not need to sortie to be effective. Her mere presence in Norwegian waters forced the British home fleet to maintain heavy units in Scapa, flow that could intercept her if she ever attempted to break out into the Atlantic convoy routes. The Admiralty could not risk another Bismarck episode where a single German battleship had required the diversion of dozens of Allied warships and had sunk HMS Hood, pride of the Royal Navy, in less than 10 minutes. Every British capital ship tied down watching the Tirpitz was a ship that could not support operations in the Mediterranean, could not escort Arctic convoys to Murman, and could not deploy to the Pacific, where the war against Japan demanded increasing resources. The strategic calculus was brutally simple. Until the Tirpitz was destroyed, she exerted an influence on Allied naval dispositions completely disproportionate to her actual combat activity. By late 1944, the Admiralty had exhausted conventional options. Torpedoes could not penetrate the anti-submarine nets protecting her anchorage. Standard Royal Air Force bombs lacked the penetrating power to defeat her armored deck, which varied from 3 to 5 in of hardened steel. Even direct hits with Dun-B bombs had proven insufficient during previous raids. The Titz's survival through multiple attacks had created a dangerous psychological narrative within both German and Allied circles that the ship was somehow unsinkable, protected by Norwegian geography, German anti-aircraft defenses, and her own massive construction. This, a belief, needed to be shattered, not merely for operational reasons, but for morale purposes that extended beyond purely military calculations. The solution emerged from the mind of Barnes Wallis, the British engineer who had designed the bouncing bomb used in the Damaster raids of May 1943. Wallis had spent years developing theories of bomb design that departed radically from conventional thinking. Standard bombs were designed to explode on impact or shortly after, releasing their energy primarily through blast effect and fragmentation. Wallis proposed something entirely different, a bomb so heavy and aerodynamically refined that it would punch through armor and concrete before detonating deep inside the target structure. The resulting explosion would occur within the target where the blast energy could not dissipate into the surrounding air, but instead had to work against the structure itself. He called it an earthquake bomb, though the principle was more accurately described as deep penetration followed by internal explosion. The Tallboy embodied this principle in 12,000 RTLB of engineering precision. The bomb measured 21 ft from nose to tail with a diameter of 3.2 at its widest point. The casing was forged from a single piece of special steel chromium molybdenum alloy machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. This casing alone weighed approximately 2.12 tons. Inside sat 5,200 pounds of Torpex explosive, a mixture more powerful than TNT that the British had developed specifically for underwater weapons, but which Wallis recognized would be equally devastating when detonated inside an enclosed structure. The bomb's aerodynamic shape had been refined through extensive wind tunnel testing at the Road Research Laboratory in Harmonsworth. Wallis had calculated that dropped from sufficient altitude, approximately 18,000 ft or higher, the Tallboy would reach supersonic speeds during its fall, achieving velocities that would allow it to penetrate 16 ft of reinforced concrete or substantial thicknesses of armor plate before the impact delayed fuse-triggered detonation. The operational challenges of delivering a Tallboy against the Tirpitz went far beyond simply loading the weapon and flying to Norway. Squadron Leader Tate commanded number 617 Squadron, the same unit that had executed the Damister raids 18 months earlier. By November 1944, 617 Squadron had evolved into the Royal Air Force's Specialist Precision Bombing Unit, the only squadron trained and equipped to deliver Barnes-Wallis's earthquake bombs against targets that conventional bombing had failed to destroy. The pilots were volunteers, mostly veterans with multiple operational tours completed, men who understood that specialist missions meant specialist risks. Their aircraft were not standard Lancasters. Each bomber had been extensively modified to carry the Tallboy's extraordinary weight and dimensions. The bomb bay doors were removed entirely and replaced with streamlined fairings that allowed the Tallboy to protrude partially below the fuselage. The mid-upper gun turret was removed to save weight and reduce drag. Additional fuel tanks were installed to provide the range necessary for strikes deep into Norway. Even with these modifications, a Lancaster carrying a Tallboy operated at the absolute edge of its performance envelope. Takeoff required every foot of available runway. Climb rate was reduced to barely 200 ft per minute. Maximum altitude with a Tallboy aboard was approximately 18,000 altitudes, achieved only after a long fuel-consuming climb that left little margin for combat maneuvering if German fighters appeared. The bombing procedure for a Tallboy strike demanded extraordinary precision. Unlike area bombing, where hundreds of aircraft dropped thousands of bombs across a large target zone, Tallboy operations required each bomber to attack individually from high altitude in stable level flight. The Bombardier used a specialized Mark 14 bomb sight, an optical computing device that calculated the trajectory based on altitude, airspeed, wind conditions, and the bomb's ballistic characteristics. The Lancaster had to fly perfectly straight and level for the final bombing run. 60 to 90 seconds of nerve-shredding exposure. Any deviation, any evasive roll or climb to dodge flak would throw off the bomb's trajectory and waste a weapon that cost more than most homes. Each Tallboy, priced at about $5,000 in 1944, represented not just money, but precious industrial capacity. Skilled hands, high-grade steel, and countless labor hours that could have produced dozens of conventional bombs. Every drop had to count. The pressure on 619 Squadron was immense. Previous Tallboy strikes against the battleship Tirpitz had failed for reasons beyond the weapon's control. During Operation Paravane on September 15, 1944, 619 Squadron had attacked the ship in Kåfjord from 14,000 feet. One bomb struck near her bow, detonating beneath the seabed and tearing open hull plates, flooding compartments. But the blow wasn't fatal. The Tirpitz stayed afloat. Damaged, yes, but still a symbol. Recognizing that she could no longer be serviced so far north, the Germans decided to move her south to Tromsø for repairs. That decision, meant to save her, placed the ship within range of RAF bases in northern Scotland. A fatal oversight. The Germans, confident in their reinforced defenses and added guns, believed Tirpitz was now secure. For Squadron Leader Tate and his bombardiers, however, the challenge was a cold equation of physics, probability, and firepower. The Tallboy's penetrating power relied entirely on impact velocity. Barnes-Wallis calculated it needed to strike at roughly 750 miles per hour to pierce armor before detonation. That speed required a drop from maximum altitude, about 18,000 feet, the upper limit of a fully loaded Lancaster. From that height, the bomb would fall for nearly 40 seconds, accelerating to near supersonic speed. During those tense seconds, The aircraft had to hold steady, offering German gunners a fixed, predictable target. The defenses around Tromsø were formidable. Dozens of 88mm flak guns, the same feared weapons used against tanks, ringed the fjord, capable of hitting targets at 26,000 feet, higher than the Lancaster's ceiling. The crews were veterans, drilled endlessly in tracking bombers. They knew their best chance came in the final approach, when attackers had to fly straight and true. Anti-aircraft doctrine demanded every gun focus on that brief, deadly window. The Tirpitz herself bristled with 20mm and 37mm cannons, creating a curtain of fire up to 10,000 feet, making low-level attack impossible. The German gun crews were seasoned veterans, many having manned the same positions for months. They knew every nuance of bomber movement and understood that a precision run required the enemy to fly straight and level, abandoning any evasive maneuvers. German anti-aircraft doctrine focused on these moments when bombers were most exposed and least able to maneuver, pouring concentrated fire into the final approach. The Tirpitz herself bristled with smaller caliber weapons, including 20mm and 37mm cannons that formed a deadly cone of fire effective up to about 10,000 feet. Though these guns couldn't reach the Lancasters cruising at 18,000 feet, they made any low-level attack impossible. Compounding the threat, the weather in northern Norway was a formidable enemy in itself. Tromsø lies deep within the Arctic Circle at 69 degrees north, where November days barely last 4 hours. The skies were almost always overcast, and temperatures at bombing altitude plunged to 30 degrees or lower, cold enough to freeze instruments and make navigation treacherous. The bombing window, those rare minutes when light and visibility aligned, was fleeting. If clouds hid the target during that brief span, the mission would fail. Fuel wasted, bombs undropped, and crews forced to turn back. At Bomber Command Headquarters, planners understood these odds with grim clarity. They knew losses were inevitable, but saw the Tirpitz as too dangerous to leave afloat. Each day she survived, tied down British capital ships, and bolstered German morale. Squadron Leader Tate grasped the stakes completely. Relying on standard bombing doctrine, holding steady for 90 seconds over the target would mean unacceptable losses for minimal results. The math was brutal. A bomber maintaining a straight run at 18,000 feet under veteran gunners faced perhaps a 60% chance of survival. Out of 29 aircraft, up to 15 could be lost. That was untenable for an elite squadron that could not be easily replaced. Tate needed a new solution, one that defied conventional high-altitude tactics but acknowledged the deadly realities of attacking a static, heavily defended target. What he devised broke every rule in the book, but it gave his men a fighting chance. At 9:41 a.m. on November 12, 1944, Tate's Lancaster entered the German flak zone. Through gaps in scattered cloud, the Tirpitz was visible below, her grey hull stark against snow-covered hills. The German batteries opened fire instantly. 88mm shells, bursting in black puffs around the lead bomber. Tate held course, making only minor corrections as his bombardier, Flying Officer Daniels, aligned the Mark 14th bomb site. Doctrine demanded up to 90 seconds of straight, steady flight. Instead, at 9:42 and 30 seconds, before the site had fully settled, Tate gave the order to release. The Tallboy fell cleanly from 6,500 feet, 2,000 feet below Barnes-Wallis's recommended altitude, but it was a calculated risk he was willing to take. The bomb was dropped during a minor turn, roughly 3 degrees off the ideal straight and level path. The airspeed indicator read 210 mph, exceeding the recommended bombing speed by 10 mph. By precision, bombing standards, all parameters were off. The bombardier's post-mission debriefing described his immediate and profane objections. Releasing early from a lower altitude during a turn, Tate seemed to have wasted Britain's costliest conventional weapon on a drop unlikely to meet the calculated impact requirements. The Tallboy descended toward the Tirpitz along a path defying Barnes-Wallace's meticulous design calculations. It should have missed. Precision bombing calculations were not mere suggestions, but governed by physical laws, dictating how an object's atmospheric trajectory depended on release conditions. Altitude, speed, and attitude all had to match the calculations, or the bomb would miss by hundreds of feet. Tate's early release appeared destined for failure. German anti-aircraft crews tracking the Lancaster saw the bomb fall and shifted fire to the next bomber, expecting yet another miss. However, Tate had accounted for a factor the German gunners and Wallace's theoretical math did not fully anticipate, arising from the realities of combat rather than controlled test conditions. Released at a higher speed during a slight turn, the Tallboy followed a trajectory differing from the calculated path. Yet difference did not mean failure. The bomb's remarkable aerodynamic efficiency, thanks to Wallace's extensive wind tunnel testing, allowed rapid stabilization after release despite non-ideal conditions. The lower altitude shortened the fall to roughly 34 seconds, while the higher release speed provided extra initial velocity. This combination resulted in an impact approximately 120 ft from the ideal drop point. Normally, a 120 ft deviation would mean a complete miss, but here it struck amidships on the Tirpitz port side, hitting between the funnel and mainmast. The impact velocity, later analyzed, was about 720 mph, slightly under Wallace's optimal value but above the minimum needed for armor penetration. The Tallboy pierced the TPI's armored deck like paper, continued through 3 internal decks, and detonated via its delayed fuse deep within the hull. 5200 lb of Torpex exploded in the port engine room below the waterline, the worst possible spot for damage control. A 40 ft by 48 ft breach flooded compartments rapidly. The ship immediately listed to port as thousands of tons of seawater poured in. Experienced damage control teams responded swiftly, but a hole this size was beyond remedy. The list grew rapidly. Within 3 minutes, the ship rolled past 20 degrees. Officers realized the situation was unrecoverable. Captain Robert Weber ordered abandonment at 9:46, barely 4 minutes after impact. Yet the command was too late for many of the 12,200 on board. The roll reached 45 Amdeg within 8 minutes. Crew trapped below in sealed compartments pounded on hatches they could not open. Survivors reaching the upper deck faced a capsizing battleship in shallow water. By 9:52, 10 minutes post-impact, the vessel rolled fully onto her port side, her starboard hull resting in Hokkaido Sound's mud with the keel exposed. Nearly 1,000 men perished, some drowned in flooded compartments, others crushed as internal structures collapsed. Many were trapped in air pockets, remaining dry but unable to escape. Shore rescue teams heard hammering from within the hull for hours. Cutting equipment and torches were used to breach the hull in several areas. 87 men were eventually rescued from the overturned wreck, pulled through holes cut in the steel by German and Norwegian workers who toiled through the night. However, for most trapped inside, the overturned Tirpitz became a tomb. The shallow water, intended to protect the ship from torpedoes by allowing it to settle on the seabed if damaged, instead caused it to capsize rather than sink upright, entrapping hundreds who might have escaped. Squadron leader Tate's Lancaster landed at Lossiemouth, Scotland at 14:35 after nearly 5 hours in the air. The plane suffered minor flak damage, with small holes in the fuselage and wings, but flight performance was unaffected. Tate's debriefing was tense. He admitted releasing the Tallboy outside prescribed parameters, acknowledging the breach of bombing doctrine, and explained that he deliberately chose this course to avoid being shot down before completing the run. Intelligence officers noted his confidence that the bomb hit its target, although confirmation required reconnaissance photos, which awaited suitable weather for a mosquito overflight of Tromsø. 2 days later, photographs confirmed the Tirpitz capsized, her hull visible above water, completely destroyed. This led to an immediate re-evaluation of Tate's bombing approach across Bomber Command. What seemed at first a reckless breach of protocol was now seen as tactical ingenuity under combat conditions. The strategic effects became evident quickly. The British Home Fleet, which had kept heavy units at Scapa Flow to counter the Tirpitz, began redeploying. The battleship Duke of York sailed for the Far East within 2 weeks to join the British Pacific Fleet against Japan, followed in later months by other capital ships, freeing resources for offensive operations. Escort carriers that had supported strikes against the Tirpitz were reassigned to convoy protection in the Atlantic and Arctic, where German U-boats remained a threat. This represented a major release of constrained forces, achieving the strategic flexibility Admiralty had sought for 3 years. The destruction of the Tirpitz with a single, accurately placed 12,000 LB bomb accomplished in one strike what dozens of previous attacks had failed to achieve: the complete elimination of Germany's final capital ship threat in European waters. Barnes-Wallis received confirmation of the Tirpitz's destruction while at his office in Weybridge, Surrey. Colleagues who observed him that day noted his quiet satisfaction rather than outward celebration. The Tallboy had performed exactly as he had anticipated, even though it was dropped outside the prescribed parameters. Its successful penetration of the Tirpitz's armor validated years of development that many had dismissed as interesting in theory, but impractical. Wallis had encountered skepticism from conventional bombing proponents who argued that resources spent on earthquake bombs could be better used to produce greater numbers of standard bombs. The Air Ministry questioned whether the tactical advantages justified the high cost and specialized training. The successful destruction of the Tirpitz decisively silenced such objections. The Tallboy achieved what thousands of conventional bombs had not. The deep penetration bombing calculations Wallis meticulously documented in notebooks and wind tunnel experiments translated seamlessly into combat effectiveness. Production of Tallboys accelerated following the Tirpitz's destruction, with British factories ultimately producing about 850 of the 12,000 LB bombs before the end of the war in Europe. These bombs were deployed against reinforced concrete U-boat pens, railway viaducts, VW weapon sites, and other hardened targets where standard bombs had proven ineffective. The results were remarkable. Structures that had endured months of conventional bombing were demolished or heavily damaged by single Tallboy strikes. The Bierfeld Railway Viaduct, a vital link in the Ruhr industrial region, collapsed after just 2 Tallboy hits in March 1945, cutting rail connections that had survived repeated conventional bombing. The Arnsberg Viaduct also succumbed to Tallboy attacks, and Bremen U-boat shelters with 16 FT thick concrete roofs, built to withstand bombing, were penetrated and rendered unusable. Each success underscored Wallis's philosophy that precision and penetration were more effective than mass and blast. Wallace further developed the Grand Slam, a 22,000 lb bomb representing the pinnacle of his earthquake bomb concept. At 25 ft long and weighing 10 tons, it required extensive Lancaster modifications to carry. Only 41 Grand Slams were dropped during the war, but their impact was devastating. The Bierfeld Viaduct, partially intact after Tallboy attacks, was completely destroyed by a single Grand Slam strike. Its penetrating power exceeded even the Tallboy's. Post-war, examinations of Grand Slam craters revealed penetration exceeding 100 ft in hard soil, with impact velocities approaching the theoretical maximum for an unpowered weapon dropped from altitude. These developments highlighted Britain's unique contribution to strategic bombing, diverging from the American focus on large-scale conventional bombing to pursue precise strikes on critical targets. Squadron leader Tate continued flying operations until war's end, completing 100 missions, an extraordinary feat reflecting both skill and remarkable luck in one of the war's most perilous assignments. He received the Distinguished Service Order and Bar for his leadership of 617 squadron and personal bombing accuracy. After the war, Tate remained in the Royal Air Force, retiring as a group captain. He seldom discussed the Tirpitz mission in detail, giving credit to his crew and to Barnes-Wallace's engineering genius. When historians and journalists pressed him about releasing the Tallboy outside doctrinal guidelines, Tate offered a characteristically candid response. Doctrine was written by men who had never faced 88 mm shells at 18,000 ft, and survival demanded adapting theory to reality. His actions became a key study in military tactics, illustrating how combat effectiveness sometimes demands bending established procedures in response to evolving circumstances. The destruction of the Tirpitz signified much more than the loss of a single vessel. It effectively ended the German surface fleet as a strategic force in the European theater. The Kriegsmarine had entered the war with ambitious plans for commerce raiding and fleet engagements to challenge British naval dominance. But by November 1944, those plans had collapsed. The Bismarck was sunk in May 1941. The Scharnhorst fell in December 1943 during the Battle of North Cape, and the Gneisenau was damaged beyond repair and eventually scuttled. The Admiral Scheer and Admiral Hipper remained operational, but were restricted to the Baltic, limited to shore bombardment, aiding German troops retreating from Soviet advances. With the Tirpitz destroyed, the last German capital ship capable of threatening Atlantic convoys was gone. The psychological effect on German sailors was severe. They had been assured that Tirpitz was invulnerable in her Norwegian anchorage, protected by geography, anti-aircraft defenses, and her formidable construction. The reality that a single British bomb destroyed her in minutes shattered that belief. This episode revealed core truths about technological warfare beyond a single mission. Barnes-Wallace's Tallboy succeeded not by sheer size or explosive power, but through precise engineering for a specific purpose, reflecting a philosophy of deeply understanding the problem before designing a solution. Wallace spent years analyzing penetration physics, supersonic aerodynamics, armor metallurgy, and the structural mechanics of large ships. The Tallboy embodied this knowledge physically, proving that sophisticated engineering applied correctly could achieve results impossible through brute force. This lesson influenced post-war weapons development across multiple fields. Tate's tactical choice, dropping outside specified parameters to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire, demonstrated critical lessons about the divergence between doctrine and combat reality. Military organizations develop standard procedures based on experience and testing, representing best practices under typical conditions, but combat rarely follows typical patterns. Weather, defenses, and tactical specifics introduce variables doctrine cannot fully anticipate. Effective leadership requires mastering doctrine to know when to adapt it, distinguishing recklessness from calculated risk. Tate's decision arose from careful analysis, evaluating his aircraft's vulnerability and trusting his bombardier to compensate for non-optimal release. The difference was crucial. Blind violation of doctrine leads to failure. Informed adaptation achieves success. The story of how one pilot's seemingly reckless bombing sank the Tirpitz shows that victories come not from strictly following rules, but from knowing when to bend them. Tate's Tallboy dropped for 34 seconds through the cold Norwegian air, following a trajectory mathematics deemed incorrect, but necessity proved it right. In that brief interval, Britain's most expensive bombing campaign succeeded where years of conventional attacks had failed. The Tirpitz capsized, nearly 1,000 men perished, and the strategic balance in the Atlantic shifted permanently. All because one pilot judged survival and accuracy more important than strict adherence to doctrine. This split-second decision altered the course of naval warfare in Europe, proving that even in technically precise warfare, human judgment remains decisive.